Iran's military aircraft, a Pakistani airbase, and the Vice President of the United States sitting at the same negotiating table, just miles away. Here's what we know. According to a CBS News report, days after a U.S.-Iran ceasefire was announced, Tehran moved multiple aircraft, including a military reconnaissance plane, onto Pakistani soil. The specific base? Nur Khan, a major Pakistan Air Force installation near Rawalpindi. The specific aircraft allegedly involved? An Iranian RC-130, the kind of plane used for surveillance and intelligence collection. Pakistan calls the report false. Donald Trump calls Pakistan's role absolutely great. Both things cannot be entirely true, and that's exactly why this story matters. Let's set the scene. It's early May 2026. The United States and Iran have been locked in a dangerous standoff, one centered on the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most vital shipping corridors on the planet. A fragile ceasefire has been brokered, and somehow, in the middle of all this, a country that shares a border with both Iran and Afghanistan, a country that has simultaneously maintained a strategic partnership with Washington, has stepped into one of the most delicate diplomatic roles in recent memory. That country is Pakistan. Pakistan rejected reports on Tuesday that it allowed Iranian aircraft to use its airfields amid tensions between the United States and Iran, claims suggesting the move could have shielded the planes from potential airstrikes, even as Islamabad positioned itself as a high-profile mediator between the two sides. This is not a routine diplomatic denial. This is a direct rebuttal of a report from a major U.S. news organization at a moment when peace negotiations are hanging by a thread, and a sitting U.S. senator is already calling for a complete reevaluation of Pakistan's entire role in this process. If you want fast, fact-based coverage on a story this complex, without the spin, subscribe now, because the layers here go deeper than most outlets are covering. To understand where we are, we need to go back to April. The U.S.-Iran conflict had pushed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil passes, into a crisis zone. Shipping was disrupted. Thousands of sailors were stranded at sea. And Washington and Tehran were exchanging pressure at a level not seen in years. Into that volatile space stepped Pakistan. In April, Pakistan had emerged as a key mediator in efforts to de-escalate tensions between Washington and Tehran amid the Strait of Hormuz crisis and the regional conflict. Islamabad hosted senior delegations for talks on April 11th and 12th after helping secure a temporary 2-week ceasefire. It was a significant moment. Pakistan, a country with its own complicated regional pressures, nuclear capability, and a history of walking diplomatic tightropes, found itself hosting some of the most consequential talks of the year. Vice President JD Vance flew to Islamabad personally. He sat across the table from Iranian delegations. Pakistan's army chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, was central to making those conversations happen. Then, the talks collapsed. Despite initial progress between the U.S. and Iran, talks in Islamabad on April 11 ultimately collapsed. Vance flew back to Washington after 16 hours of negotiations that ended without a breakthrough. The ceasefire remained fragile, and Pakistan, to its credit, kept pushing. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif declared publicly that Islamabad remained very optimistic that the current momentum will lead to a lasting agreement. Now here's where the story takes a sharp turn. According to the CBS report, officials said that days after Trump announced a ceasefire with Iran in early April, Tehran sent multiple aircraft to Pakistan Air Force Base Nur Khan. Among the aircraft reportedly moved there was an Iranian Air Force RC-130, a reconnaissance and intelligence gathering variant of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules. Think about what that means. The RC-130 is not a cargo plane. It's not a diplomatic transport. It's a surveillance aircraft, the kind used to gather intelligence, monitor communications, and track military movements. And according to CBS, Iran moved one to a Pakistani base during the period when Pakistan was serving as the official neutral venue for U.S.-Iran peace negotiations. The alleged motive? Protection. The suggestion embedded in the reporting was that Iran may have been using Pakistan's airspace and facilities as a sanctuary, a place where its remaining aerial assets could not be targeted by U.S. strikes. The alleged Iranian asset movements had also suggested there was an effort by Iran to conceal some of its remaining aerial assets, as Pakistan worked behind the scenes to broker a ceasefire between Iran and the United States. Pakistan's foreign ministry pushed back immediately. Pakistan said Tuesday the CBS report was misleading and sensationalized. Such speculative narratives appear aimed at undermining ongoing efforts for regional stability and peace. Islamabad's explanation was straightforward. Aircraft from both Iran and the United States arrived in Pakistan to move diplomatic personnel, security staff, and support teams connected to the talks process. Some aircraft and support personnel remained temporarily in Pakistan in anticipation of subsequent rounds of engagement, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said. That's Pakistan's position, Iranian diplomatic logistics, nothing more. But Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, wasn't buying it. If this reporting is accurate, it would require a complete reevaluation of the role Pakistan is playing as mediator between Iran, the United States, and other parties. Given some of the prior statements by Pakistani defense officials towards Israel, I would not be shocked if this were true, Graham said in a post shared on X. And here's the contradiction at the center of all of this. Even as Graham and CBS were raising alarms, the President of the United States was going in the opposite direction entirely. President Donald Trump confirmed Tuesday he was satisfied with the mediation work carried out by Pakistan, telling reporters ahead of his trip to China that they were great. I think the Pakistanis have been great. The Field Marshal and the Prime Minister of Pakistan have been absolutely great, Trump clarified. The White House, U.S. Central Command, and the government of Pakistan had all been contacted for further comment as of the report's publication. None had formally responded. So the question isn't just whether Iran hid planes on Pakistani soil. The deeper question is this: did the United States know? And if it did, was that the price of keeping Pakistan at the table? Pakistan's position in this crisis was never simple. Let's be clear about what Islamabad was actually being asked to do. Pakistan's position was unique, given its geographic proximity to Iran and its long-standing strategic partnership with the United States. It shares a long border with Iran to the west. It has received billions in U.S. security assistance over decades. It has its own nuclear arsenal. And its military, led by Field Marshal Asim Munir, carries enormous political weight inside the country, arguably more than any civilian government. Asking Pakistan to host U.S.-Iran peace talks was asking it to thread a needle that would challenge any country. Mediation efforts were led by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, Army Chief General Asim Munir, and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar. This wasn't a foreign ministry side project. This was the top of Pakistan's government, its army chief personally, directly engaged. That level of involvement signals how seriously Islamabad took the role, or how much pressure it was under to take it. Now consider the strategic implications of the CBS reporting, if accurate. An Iranian reconnaissance aircraft parked on a Pakistani military base is not just a political problem, it's a potential intelligence problem. An RC-130 variant can carry signals intelligence equipment. If Iranian surveillance capabilities were being operated, or simply protected, from inside a Pakistani base, the questions that raises for U.S. operational security in the region are significant. What could those aircraft see? What communications were they monitoring? And how close were those capabilities to the Americans who were flying into the same Pakistani airspace for peace talks? We don't know the answers. Those details are not in the confirmed reporting. But the questions themselves are not paranoia. They are the standard operational concerns that any intelligence professional would raise. Do you think Pakistan was genuinely neutral here, or was it playing both sides? Let me know in the comments below. The range of opinions on this story is already enormous. There's also the question of what this does to the ceasefire going forward. Trump's initiative to help thousands of stranded crew lasted 48 hours, with the president later acknowledging that it was halted at the request of Pakistan and other countries, including Saudi Arabia, to avoid jeopardizing ongoing negotiations with Iran. The U.S. actually paused its own maritime operation, Project Freedom, designed to protect commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, partly at Pakistan's request. That's a meaningful concession. It shows how much Washington was relying on Islamabad's goodwill to keep negotiations alive. If the CBS report cracks that trust, even partially, the fragile architecture holding this ceasefire together starts to look a lot less stable. Here's the detail almost everyone is overlooking. According to the report, Tehran was also said to have possibly sent a civilian aircraft to Afghanistan during the conflict. Afghanistan, a country with virtually no functioning central government, a country that borders both Iran and Pakistan, a country where the U.S. has near zero presence and oversight. If Iran was moving assets to Afghanistan during this conflict, even under civilian cover, the implications for tracking Iran's actual military posture are far more complicated than what the headline story suggests. We are not just talking about one reconnaissance plane on one Pakistani base. We may be looking at a deliberate dispersal strategy, Iran spreading its remaining aerial assets across multiple jurisdictions where U.S. targeting is legally and practically constrained. That changes the calculus of this entire crisis in ways that haven't yet fully entered the public conversation. Behind all the diplomatic language, the press releases, the denials, the Senate floor statements, there are real people whose lives are caught in the machinery of this standoff. Think about the sailors. At the height of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, thousands of merchant crew members were stranded. Cargo ships sitting in waters where both Iranian and American military assets were operating. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It is one of those places on the map where the geography itself becomes a trap. For the men and women on those vessels, cargo handlers, engineers, navigators, cooks, the conflict was not abstract geopolitics. It was a matter of whether the ship they lived on would be allowed to move, whether resupply would reach them, whether their families would hear from them again. As part of the next response, Trump launched Project Freedom to guide vessels through the Strait of Hormuz and to help free up shipping. That operation was designed to be a lifeline, and for 48 hours it ran. Vessels began moving. Crews who had been waiting for days got word that passage was being coordinated. Then it stopped. Trump later acknowledged that Project Freedom was halted at the request of Pakistan and other countries, including Saudi Arabia, to avoid jeopardizing ongoing negotiations with Iran. Let that settle for a moment. A humanitarian escort operation designed specifically to protect civilian shipping and the people aboard those vessels was paused because the diplomatic situation was too fragile to risk an incident. Those sailors went back to waiting, and the diplomatic talks they were waiting for, they collapsed anyway on April 11th after 16 hours of negotiations in Islamabad that produced nothing final. Now layer in Pakistan's domestic situation. Pakistan in 2026 is not a country operating from a position of uncomplicated strength. It has been navigating an economy under severe IMF-linked pressure, an internal political environment that remains deeply fractured after years of instability, and a military that has become the dominant power in nearly every significant national decision. Field Marshal Asim Munir is not simply an army chief in the conventional sense. He has emerged as the central figure in Pakistan's political and security architecture. When Trump says, "The Field Marshal has been absolutely great," he is, in effect, acknowledging that it is Munir, not the elected civilian government alone, who is driving Pakistan's foreign policy on this issue. That dynamic matters, because if there are questions about whether Pakistan sheltered Iranian aircraft, those questions ultimately point to Munir's decision-making. And those questions are being asked at the exact moment when Munir's international stature, shaped in large part by his success as a peace broker, is at its peak. For ordinary Pakistanis watching this unfold, the position is uncomfortable. Their country is being praised by Washington on the front page and questioned by Washington in the Senate hearing room, both at the same time. That kind of contradiction is deeply familiar to countries that have historically been caught between great power rivalries. But living inside that contradiction never gets easier. And for Iranians, for the civilian population inside a country that has been under tremendous economic and military pressure, the question of whether their government's aircraft were on a Pakistani base is almost secondary to the bigger fear, which is, are the talks actually going somewhere? Is this standoff going to end? Or are their leaders using every pause in fighting as cover to reposition, rearm, and reset? That fear that the ceasefire is theater while the underlying conflict remains unsettled is not limited to Iran. It lives in Pakistan's border communities. It lives among oil workers in the Gulf. It lives among shipping companies calculating whether the Strait will still be passable next month. However, Pakistani leadership said it felt optimistic. "We are very optimistic that the current momentum will lead to a lasting agreement," Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said. Optimism is not a plan, and right now the gap between the optimism being expressed publicly and the questions being asked privately is very, very wide. Senator Graham has made a direct threat. If the CBS reporting checks out, Pakistan's entire mediation role goes under review. That's not a senator venting on social media. Graham sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee. His position carries institutional weight. And here's what makes the next few days critical. Fox News Digital has confirmed it reached out to the White House, U.S. Central Command, and the government of Pakistan for comment, and none had responded as of the report's publication. Silence from U.S. Central Command on a story that involves alleged Iranian military aircraft on a Pakistani base near U.S. diplomatic personnel is not an ordinary silence. The ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran is described by Trump himself as being on massive life support. The next round of talks in Islamabad has not yet been confirmed, and the reconnaissance aircraft question, which Pakistan says is a distortion and the CBS sources say is real, now hangs over every future conversation these three governments try to have with each other. Step back from the details for a moment. Look at the shape of this situation. You have a conflict between the United States and Iran that has destabilized one of the most critical economic choke points on Earth. You have a ceasefire that has repeatedly been described as fragile, as barely alive, as contingent on a diplomatic process that collapsed once already. And you have Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state with a military-dominated foreign policy, a geographic position between U.S. interests and Iranian ones, and a clear stake in regional stability, being asked to hold the middle ground. Trump also praised Pakistan's mediating role again, stating on May 7th, "Pakistan has been fantastic, and its leaders have been fantastic, the Marshal and the Prime Minister." That praise from Trump is meaningful, but it also reveals something about the limitations of what Washington actually knows, or is willing to say publicly, about what happened during Pakistan's mediation. Here's the historical context worth holding in mind. Pakistan has played the role of indispensable intermediary before. During the Cold War, it was the critical conduit for U.S. arms flowing to Afghan mujahideen fighting Soviet forces, a role that benefited Washington enormously in the short term and produced consequences that outlasted the Cold War by decades. The pattern of Pakistan serving American strategic needs while simultaneously managing its own relationships with neighboring powers is not new. What's different now is the speed at which information travels, and the speed at which a CBS report can force every government in this equation to publicly account for their choices. The question of Iranian aircraft at Nur Khan is, in one sense, a narrow factual dispute. Either the planes were there in a military capacity or they weren't. Either Pakistan was facilitating Iranian force protection or it was managing logistical support for a peace process. But in a larger sense, the question is about the architecture of trust that a fragile ceasefire depends on. U.S.-Iran negotiations are not conducted between parties with a history of goodwill. Every channel, every venue, every intermediary has to be trusted by both sides, at least minimally, for the process to function. If either Washington or Tehran comes to believe that Pakistan is tilted more significantly toward the other side than publicly acknowledged, the entire scaffolding of Islamabad as neutral host collapses. That's what Senator Graham understood when he posted his statement. That's what U.S. intelligence analysts are quietly working through right now. And that's what Pakistan's foreign ministry was scrambling to address when it called the CBS report misleading and sensationalized. One more thread deserves attention. The article notes that Trump paused Project Freedom, the maritime escort operation, partly at Pakistan's request. That means Pakistan had enough leverage with Washington to influence an active U.S. military and logistical operation. That is a significant degree of influence for a country that is simultaneously being asked whether it sheltered the aircraft of the opposing party. Where does this go from here? Several scenarios are possible. The White House could quietly validate Pakistan's explanation, keeping the mediation structure intact and downgrading the CBS report as unconfirmed speculation. Or the silence from U.S. Central Command could eventually give way to a more nuanced acknowledgement, one that validates some of what CBS reported while framing it in a way that preserves the diplomatic relationship. Or the talks could resume, produce no breakthrough, and the aircraft question fades into the background of an unresolved conflict. What seems least likely is a clean resolution, a moment where every government involved says clearly what happened and why. That kind of clarity is rare even in straightforward diplomatic stories. In a situation this layered, with this many competing interests, the fog tends to linger long after the headlines move on. The ceasefire is still alive, just barely by Trump's own description. The next round of Islamabad talks has not been confirmed, and the question of what Pakistan actually allowed to happen on its soil and what Washington actually knew about it remains open. This story is not done. The next 72 hours, the White House response, CENTCOM's answer, Pakistan's follow-up position, could fundamentally reshape what we understand about how this ceasefire was actually built and who was really protecting whose interests. What do you think? Was Pakistan running a genuinely neutral operation, or was something more complicated happening behind closed doors? Drop your read in the comments. This is exactly the kind of story where different perspectives matter. And subscribe, because when the next response comes from Washington or Islamabad, we'll have the full context already built, and you'll understand it faster than anywhere else.